A judge insulted Karoline Leavitt right in court, and minutes later Attorney General Pam Bondi had him handcuffed. You won't believe what just happened. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Karoline Leavitt stepped into the courtroom, her eyes sharp, her demeanor poised. An image not to be underestimated. At 27, she's the youngest White House press secretary in history, and today she's representing the Trump administration to confront a major corruption case. Robert Mitchell, a wealthy developer with deep political ties, is accused of funneling public funds into his private projects. From the bench, Judge Edward Thornton observed her with cold caution. Leavitt was no stranger to pressure from the media and politics, though her youth had once been questioned. But this was different. This was a fight for justice, and she knew Thornton wasn't just a tough judge. He was notorious for his sharp tongue and unpredictable rulings. Hours earlier at the White House, Pam Bondi had warned Leavitt, "Thornton's got something shady about him, be careful with him." Leavitt approached the plaintiff's table, holding a thick stack of documents, fraudulent invoices, suspicious transactions, and a signature that raised her suspicions. The eyes of the jury, reporters, and Mitchell, who wore a confident smirk, followed her every move, but then Thornton spoke, his voice calm yet commanding. "Miss Leavitt, I must ask, what's the White House's intent in sending someone as young as you here? This is a courtroom, not a press room." The courtroom fell into a brief silence after Judge Edward Thornton's opening remark, quickly broken by a faint chuckle from Robert Mitchell's defense attorney. Leavitt, unfazed, began, her deep, steady voice resonating with authority. "I trust you've come prepared to present before this court today. This is a place of law, and I expect you to bring grounded arguments." He tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his gaze fixed on her as if reminding her he controlled this courtroom. Leavitt nodded slightly, resting her hand on the documents before her, her fingers brushing the first page as a quiet affirmation. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the murmurs from the back rows. "I'm here to present the truth. Robert Mitchell embezzled millions from public funds, and I have the evidence to prove it." She opened the file, pulling out a bank statement marked in red. This is a financial record from Mitchell's company, showing a $5 million transfer from public funds to a personal account, far exceeding the approved amount. Thornton furrowed his brow, his arms crossed over his chest, his calm demeanor masking a hint of skepticism. "Financial records," he said, his tone even but tinged with scrutiny, "are something this court has reviewed in many cases before. I expect you can clearly explain what these numbers mean rather than just displaying them." A small laugh came from the defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, his hair neatly combed. Robert Mitchell sat beside him, hands clasped, the corner of his mouth twitching upward as if he believed everything was still under control. Leavitt took a deep breath, keeping her breathing steady. She knew Thornton was testing her, subtly but pointedly questioning her confidence. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice rising slightly for emphasis, "if I may, I'll explain. This $5 million transfer has no legitimate documentation to support it. Furthermore, we have witness testimony confirming Mitchell used those funds for personal gain." She held up the paper, her eyes locked on Thornton. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing, as if weighing her words. "Witness testimony and documents," he said, his voice lowering, "are elements that require careful scrutiny for authenticity. I trust what you're presenting isn't mere speculation, Ms. Leavitt." He tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his gaze sweeping the room as if to reinforce his control. "Proceed, but I expect clarity and focus." The courtroom grew tenser. A female juror in the front row wearing a dark blue jacket frowned at Thornton as if sensing the rigidity in his tone. A reporter whispered to a colleague, "He's giving her a hard time," but Leavitt didn't notice. She set the bank statement down, pulling out a contract signed between Mitchell's company and the City Planning Commission. "Your Honor, this contract lists the project cost as $2 million, but the actual transfer was $5 million. This discrepancy isn't random. It's evidence of fraud." Thornton interrupted, his voice ringing with sternness. "Miss Leavitt, I must ask you to be cautious with such accusations. This court doesn't tolerate hasty conclusions. If you intend to argue fraud, I expect you to provide more concrete evidence." He tapped his gavel lightly on the bench, the small sound a reminder of his authority. Present more, but I won't tolerate imprecision. Leavitt stood still, her gaze unwavering. She sensed Thornton was trying to maintain the upper hand, forcing her to prove every minute detail, but she hadn't come here to back down. Your Honor, she said, her voice sharp yet respectful, I respect your demand for precision, so I propose the court closely examine these documents, and if needed, I'm prepared to request an independent audit to verify them. Her words were a polite challenge, silencing the courtroom. Mitchell's defense attorney frowned, the smile on his face beginning to fade. Thornton leaned forward, his hands on the bench, his eyes locked on Leavitt. You're suggesting an independent audit in my courtroom? He asked, his voice low but carrying a warning. I remind you, this is where I decide what's reviewed, Ms. Leavitt. I expect you to understand your role in this process. He tapped his gavel again, his gaze unrelenting as if trying to subdue her with his presence. She stood tall, unflinching. Your Honor, I fully understand my role to ensure the truth is fully presented to this court. With your permission, I'll proceed with further evidence. She pushed the documents forward, her eyes fixed on Thornton. May we continue? The courtroom air grew heavy, like the calm before a storm. The white ceiling lights cast a glow on Karoline Leavitt's poised figure at the plaintiff's table. She stood there, hands resting lightly on the documents, her gaze locked on Judge Edward Thornton at the bench. He sat upright, arms crossed over his black robe, his stern face etched with deep lines, the marks of decades wielding justice. After Leavitt's final request to proceed, Thornton spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of authority. Miss Leavitt, I'll allow you to continue, but I expect you to present with the clarity and precision this courtroom demands. Leavitt nodded slightly, maintaining her professionalism. Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your guidance, she replied, her voice ringing with confidence, drowning out the murmurs from the back. I have no intention of presenting anything but the truth. She gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to assert her control. The female juror in the dark blue jacket shifted in her seat, her eyes moving from Thornton to Leavitt as if weighing who held the upper hand. Thornton tapped his hand lightly on the bench, his eyes narrowing. The truth is what this court always seeks, he said, his tone even, but edged with caution. I've been in this position long enough to distinguish between grounded arguments and baseless accusations. Proceed, but I won't tolerate any conjecture. His tapping echoed steadily, like a drumbeat reminding everyone of his power in the room. Leavitt drew a deep breath, keeping her breathing even. She knew Thornton wasn't just controlling the courtroom, he was testing her, forcing her to prove every detail under his strict scrutiny. She opened the file, pulling out a thicker subcontract marked in red ink. Your Honor, I present this contract, signed between Robert Mitchell's company and a non-existent contractor. This document conceals a $3 million transfer to his personal account. She held it up, her voice calm but weighty. We have bank records confirming this transaction. The courtroom stirred. The female juror in blue leaned forward, her eyes widening. Robert Mitchell, at the defendant's table, clenched his hands, his confident smile now a distorted curve. His defense attorney, the man in the gray suit, stood. Objection, Your Honor. This document hasn't been fully verified before this court. His voice was firm, but lacked its usual certainty, as if he felt the rising pressure. Thornton raised a hand, signaling the attorney to sit, his eyes never leaving Leavitt. Miss Leavitt, he said, his voice lowering with gravity, this court demands all documents be clearly authenticated before consideration. I expect you can provide the lawful origin of this evidence, not just rely on numbers. He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound reinforcing his authority. Explain clearly if you can. Leavitt didn't waver. She set the contract down, pulling out a transaction statement with a digital bank signature. Your Honor, I respect your demand for authenticity. This is evidence legally obtained by the Justice Department, and I believe it addresses all your concerns. She held it up, her eyes fixed on Thornton. If I may ask, do you believe these documents need more time for review, or shall I proceed? Thornton leaned forward, hands on the bench, his sharp gaze piercing her. Are you questioning my process, Miss Leavitt? He asked, his voice low but laced with warning. I remind you that all evidence presented in this court must meet strict legal standards. I won't accept any ambiguity in your arguments. He tapped his gavel again, his eyes sweeping the room to assert his control. Leavitt stood tall, her gaze unflinching. She sensed Thornton trying to maintain the upper hand, but she hadn't come here to yield. "Your Honor, I fully understand the court's standards," she said, her voice sharp yet respectful. "So with your permission, I propose pausing the trial to have these documents fully verified, a step I believe will clarify the truth." Her proposal struck Thornton like an arrow, causing him to lean back in his chair, his breathing growing heavier. "Pause the trial?" Thornton repeated, his tone even but tinged with doubt. "You're requesting something unusual, Miss Leavitt. I remind you this is a trial under my direction, and I will decide when a pause is warranted." He tapped his gavel lightly, his eyes fixed on her. "However, if you believe you have additional substantial evidence, I'll allow you to proceed, provided it's clear and convincing." The courtroom fell deathly silent. A reporter in the back row stopped writing, his pen hovering over the paper. The female juror in the blue jacket clenched her hands, her eyes locked on Leavitt. Mitchell lifted his head, his anxious gaze darting to his attorney, who whispered something with a tense expression. Everyone could feel it. Something bigger was looming. Leavitt let the silence linger for a second, then reached down for another document, a call transcript marked confidential, from the Justice Department. She didn't open it yet, just place it on the table, her hand gently brushing the cover. "Your Honor," she said, her voice low but piercing, "I deeply appreciate your patience. With your permission, I'll present another piece of evidence, one I believe will resolve any doubts you have about this case." Thornton sat upright, his hands resting on the oak bench, his narrowed eyes observing her with cold caution. The courtroom was so quiet that Robert Mitchell's rapid breathing from the defendant's table rang out clearly. Thornton finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of authority. "Miss Leavitt, I've allowed you to continue. I expect your next piece of evidence to meet this court's rigorous standards." Leavitt let the silence stretch for a second, her eyes never leaving him. Then she reached to open the transcript, but a faint buzz from her coat pocket stopped her. She glanced down quickly, seeing a text flash on the screen. "Thornton directly involved. Check the signature on the subcontract. J." J was Jake, the investigative reporter she'd worked with before, a man with consistently reliable sources. She took a deep breath, deciding to set aside the recording and pursue this new lead. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but weighty, "before I present the transcript, I'd like to return to the subcontract I mentioned earlier." She pulled the document back from the table, flipping quickly to the last page where a black ink signature stood out among the fine print. "This contract bears the approval signature of a senior official," she said, her voice clear. "And I'd like to ask you, Your Honor, do you recognize this signature?" She held up the document, her eyes locked on Thornton. He frowned, his hands gripping the edge of the bench for a second before relaxing. "A signature?" he replied, his tone even but questioning. "Miss Leavitt, I don't make a habit of memorizing every stroke from the hundreds of documents that cross my desk. I expect you to provide a specific reason for me to consider this." His voice deepened, his gaze sweeping the room as if to remind everyone of his authority. Leavitt gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to affirm she was on the right track. "Your Honor, I deeply respect your caution," she said, her voice sharp yet reverent. "I believe you'll recognize this signature because it's yours, Edward Thornton." She placed the document on the table, exposing the signature clearly for all to see. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. A reporter in the back whispered, "What the hell?" before being pulled back by a colleague. The female juror in the blue jacket covered her mouth, her eyes shifting from surprise to suspicion. Robert Mitchell snapped his head up, his panicked gaze darting to his attorney, who now leaned down to whisper something with a strained expression. But Thornton didn't react immediately. He sat still, his eyes glued to the document, his breathing growing heavier. "Ms. Leavitt," he finally spoke, his voice low but carrying a warning. "I must ask you to be cautious with such accusations. This court isn't a place for baseless conclusions. I expect you to prove the lawful origin of that document." He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound enough to bolster his authority. Leavitt didn't back down. She rested her hand on the table, her gaze steady. "Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your request," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "This document was obtained by the Justice Department through a lawful subpoena." Your signature is on a transaction transferring $3 million to Mitchell's non-existent company. If you'll allow, I'm prepared to present further evidence to clarify this matter." She gestured toward the transcript still on the table, a reminder of the card she hadn't yet played. Thornton leaned forward, his hands on the bench, his sharp gaze piercing her. "You're making a serious accusation, Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice deepening with gravity. "I remind you that all evidence presented in this court must comply with strict legal regulations. I won't accept the use of documents without full verification." He tapped his gavel again, his eyes fixed on her. Leavitt sensed Thornton trying to hold the upper hand, but Jake's message had changed everything. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice low but forceful, "if you doubt the document's authenticity, I propose pausing the trial for an independent agency to verify it, a step I believe will safeguard this trial's fairness." Her proposal cut like a sharp blade, causing Thornton to lean back in his chair, his breathing growing heavier. "Pause the trial?" Thornton repeated, his tone even but tinged with doubt. "You're requesting something unusual, Miss Leavitt. I remind you that I'm the one overseeing this trial, and I'll decide when such action is needed." He tapped his gavel lightly, his gaze sweeping the room as if to assert his control. Leavitt stood still, her eyes locked on him. Her mind flashed to memories of cases twisted by powerful judges. Thornton was no exception. He'd presided over dozens of major cases, but his reputation wasn't entirely spotless. She flipped the document again, comparing the signature to another copy in the file. There was no doubt. It was Thornton's, signed 3 months ago. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Your Honor, I believe we need to discuss this further, and I have a feeling the next piece of evidence will make you reconsider." The courtroom sank into stifling silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of Judge Edward Thornton from the bench. Karoline Leavitt stood at the plaintiff's table, her gaze as sharp as a blade, holding the document with Thornton's signature, clear evidence of his connection to Robert Mitchell. She'd just issued a warning, "I have a feeling the next piece of evidence will make you reconsider." Thornton sat still, his hands on the oak bench, his narrowed eyes observing her with cold caution. He said nothing, but the tension in the air was palpable. He was facing a dangerous situation. Leavitt took a deep breath, steadying her heartbeat. She knew this was the decisive moment, not just for the case, but for the credibility of the Trump administration she represented. She placed the document with Thornton's signature on the table, then slowly pulled the call transcript from the file. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and resonant, slicing through the silence like a sword. "I've presented your signature on the contract transferring $3 million to Mr. Mitchell and asked you to explain. Since you haven't responded, I'll let your own words clarify this matter." Thornton leaned forward, his voice deepening with gravity. "Miss Leavitt, I must ask you to proceed with caution," he said, his sharp gaze piercing her. "This court isn't a place for baseless accusations. I expect any evidence you present to be fully verified per legal procedure." He tapped his gavel lightly, the small sound reinforcing his authority. Leavitt didn't let him interrupt further. She raised a hand, signaling him to stop, then turned to the court clerk. "Sir, please prepare the recorder. I want everyone in this room to hear every word clearly." The courtroom held its breath. The female juror in the blue jacket leaned forward, her eyes wide. Robert Mitchell bowed his head, his hands trembling on the defendant's table. His defense attorney, the man in the gray suit, shot up. "Objection, Your Honor, this doesn't follow legal procedure." But Thornton merely raised a hand, signaling him to sit, his eyes fixed on Leavitt. "Miss Leavitt," Thornton said, his voice low but carrying a warning, "if you intend to present a recording, I expect it to meet this court's rigorous legal standards. I won't tolerate any action that undermines this trial's fairness." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, his gaze locked on her. Leavitt gave a faint smile, not to provoke, but to assert her control. "Your Honor, I deeply appreciate your caution," she replied, her voice calm but cutting. "This recording was obtained by the Justice Department through a lawful wiretap. I believe you'll find it meets the standards you require." She nodded to the clerk, who quickly set the recorder on the table and pressed play. A faint static crackled, then Thornton's deep, authoritative voice emerged. "Don't let her find those contracts. If she gets evidence, I'll make it disappear before it reaches the court." The courtroom exploded in stunned murmurs. A reporter in the back gasped, "Oh my God!" before being pulled back by a colleague. The female juror in the blue jacket covered her mouth, her eyes shifting from shock to outrage. A male juror with salt and pepper hair shook his head slowly, as if unable to believe his ears. Mitchell snapped his head up, his face pale, his panicked eyes darting to his attorney. But all eyes ultimately turned to Thornton. He sat still, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, his gaze fixed on the recorder. His face flushed red, then paled, as if life had drained from him. "That recording," he spoke, his voice hoarse but striving for dignity. "I demand its origin be reviewed. This court cannot accept evidence without full verification." He tapped his gavel lightly, but the sound was feeble, lacking its usual strength. Leavitt interrupted him, her voice sharp yet respectful. "Your Honor, I deeply respect your request," she said, "but this recording has been verified by the Justice Department. Who were you speaking to in that call, and why did you want to conceal evidence in the very case you're presiding over?" She stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Thornton. He shot to his feet, hands on the bench, his voice deepening with gravity but trembling. "Miss Leavitt, I warn you," he said, his eyes flashing with a rare spark of anger, "I won't allow any action that undermines this trial's fairness. I demand a pause on presenting this recording until it's verified by an independent agency." He struck his gavel harder, the sound echoing through the room as if trying to reclaim control. Leavitt stood still, her gaze unwavering. She knew she'd hit his weak spot, and she wasn't about to stop. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice low but forceful, "if you doubt its authenticity, I welcome a verification. But allow me to return to your signature on this contract." She held up the document again, her eyes locked on him. "Would you like to explain why your signature appears on an illegal transaction, or should I let the jury decide for themselves?" Thornton breathed heavily, his chest heaving like a cornered animal. "Miss Leavitt," he said, his voice low but carrying a warning, "I remind you that I'm the one overseeing this trial. I won't accept any accusations without clear, verified evidence." He struck his gavel again, his gaze sweeping the room as if to assert his authority. Leavitt stood tall, her eyes never leaving him. "Your Honor, I deeply respect your role," she said, her voice rising, clear and firm as she turned to the jury. "But your signature on this contract, combined with the recording, reveals a clear truth. There's a conspiracy between Mr. Mitchell and a senior official to embezzle public funds. I propose pausing the trial for federal investigators to take over." She stepped back, resting her hand on the table, her eyes fixed on Thornton. The courtroom descended into chaos after Karoline Leavitt's final proposal. Murmurs from the jury mingled with the rapid scribbling of reporters, while Robert Mitchell clutched his head, his hands trembling, as if realizing everything had collapsed. Judge Edward Thornton sat at the bench, his eyes glued to the oak table, his face taut with deeper-than-usual wrinkles. He just whispered, "You can't request that." But his voice was weak, lacking the authority that once made him an icon in this courtroom. Leavitt stood firm at the plaintiff's table, her gaze locked on him, awaiting his next move. But before Thornton could regain his composure, the main doors burst open with a loud bang, startling everyone to turn around. Pam Bondi strode in, her presence commanding in a sharp black suit, her blonde hair tied neatly back. Behind her were two Justice Department officers in uniform, handcuffs in hand, their eyes cold. Her heels clicked steadily on the wooden floor, each step like a hammer striking the stifling silence. Leavitt turned unsurprised. She'd known Bondi was watching from afar, waiting for this moment. Reporters erupted, cameras flashing relentlessly, one shouting, "The Attorney General's here!" But Bondi paid no mind, her eyes locked on Thornton like a justice enforcer facing a betrayer. "Judge Edward Thornton," Bondi declared, her voice low but cutting through the room. "I am Pamela Bondi, United States Attorney General. Under my authority, I declare you under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power." Her words were a final verdict, shattering Thornton's last shred of hope. He snapped his head up, eyes wide with shock, mouth stammering as if to protest. The courtroom exploded in noise. The female juror in the blue jacket shot to her feet, covering her mouth in shock. A male juror with salt and pepper hair whispered to his neighbor, "I knew it, something was off." Mitchell yelled at his attorney, "Do something," but the attorney just bowed his head, scribbling notes in vain. Reporters surged forward, snapping photos, flashes bursting like fireworks, but Bondi remained steady, She raised a hand, signaling the officers to advance. Thornton stood abruptly, hands on the bench, his voice deepening with gravity but trembling. "Miss Bondi, I must protest this action," he said, his eyes flashing with rare anger. "This is a trial under my direction, and I demand a full explanation before any measures are taken." He tapped his gavel lightly, the faint sound a last-ditch effort to cling to authority. Bondi stepped closer, her cold gaze piercing him. "Mr. Thornton," she replied, her voice low but commanding, "you no longer have the authority to demand anything in this courtroom. Your signature on an illegal contract and the recording obtained by the Justice Department prove you not only knew of Mr. Mitchell's embezzlement but participated in it. You will have your chance to explain in court, but not here." She nodded to the officers behind her. "Execute the arrest." The two officers stepped forward, one pulling handcuffs from his belt, the other grasping Thornton's shoulder. He jerked back, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a gross violation of legal procedure," he said, his eyes sweeping the room as if seeking support. "I demand to review this arrest warrant before any action is taken." But his resistance faded as the click of the handcuffs rang out, locking his wrists together. The metallic sound was a full stop, echoing in a courtroom now without its judge. Leavitt stood still, watching it all with calm eyes. She'd done her part, exposed the truth, laid the groundwork for Bondi to finish it. Bondi turned to her, giving a slight nod, a brief but meaningful gesture. "Good work, Karoline," she whispered, her voice low enough for only her to hear. Leavitt smiled faintly, saying nothing. Their coordination needed no words. The Justice Department officers pulled Thornton down from the bench, leading him through the courtroom aisle. He stumbled, head bowed, avoiding the eyes of the jury that once revered him. A reporter shouted, "Judge Thornton, do you have anything to say?" But he didn't respond. The officer's footsteps echoed steadily, blending with the growing murmurs of the crowd. As the side door opened, Thornton glanced back at Leavitt one last time, his eyes filled with resentment. But she stood there, unmoving, a victor without need for boast. The courtroom remained in shock. Mitchell sat still, hands clutching his head, his face ashen. His attorney whispered something, but he didn't react. Their plans had gone up in smoke. The jurors exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others whispering in indignation. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras and phones raised high, flashes bursting to preserve Thornton's handcuffed exit forever. Bondi turned back, facing the courtroom. "This trial is paused until a new judge is appointed," she announced, her voice ringing with authority. "The Justice Department will continue investigating to uncover the full truth. Justice will be served, no matter who's involved." She paused, her gaze sweeping to Mitchell, now shrinking in his seat. "Mr. Mitchell, I suggest you prepare yourself. We're not done." The murmurs flared again, but Bondi ignored them. She stepped closer to Leavitt, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You made history today," she said, her voice low but warm. "Thornton thought he was untouchable, but you proved otherwise." Leavitt nodded, her eyes still sharp. "Thank you, but I know you're the one who sealed it." The side door closed behind Judge Edward Thornton, the sound of handcuffs echoing like the end of his once powerful career. Karoline Leavitt stood at the plaintiff's table, her gaze piercing, her hand resting lightly on the documents, now historic evidence. Pam Bondi, after ordering Thornton's removal, turned to her with a brief nod, then exited the courtroom with the two Justice Department officers. But the atmosphere didn't settle. It ignited like a freshly lit flame. Robert Mitchell remained at the defendant's table, hands clutching his head, his face pale as paper. His attorney, the man in the gray suit, whispered something with a tense expression, but Mitchell didn't respond. He looked up, his panicked eyes scanning the room, then shouted, "I'll cooperate. I'll tell everything, I swear." His voice cracked, almost pleading, but Leavitt didn't flinch. She turned to him, her voice cold but calm. "Mr. Mitchell, you've had your chance to do the right thing. Now you'll face the consequences. No deals here." The murmurs from the jury grew louder. The female juror in the blue jacket stood, staring at Mitchell with a mix of shock and disdain. A male juror with salt and pepper hair shook his head slowly, whispering to his neighbor, "I suspected something from the start." They were no longer passive observers. They'd just witnessed a powerful judge's downfall, and faith in justice began to stir in their eyes. Reporters sprang into action like a swarm of bees from a broken hive. Cameras flashed relentlessly, phones raised to capture every moment. One shouted to a colleague, "Send it now! Thornton arrested in court. This is front-page news." Another posted on X, "Karoline Leavitt exposes Judge Thornton's conspiracy. Pam Bondi cuffs him on the spot. Justice prevails." Within minutes, the post spread, with thousands of likes and comments. "Leavitt and Bondi are an unstoppable duo," or "Finally, justice is served." Leavitt glanced at the crowd, knowing this story would reach far beyond this room. She turned back to the table, gathering her documents with remarkable calm. The court clerk, a middle-aged man with round glasses, approached, his voice trembling. "Miss Leavitt, I've never seen anything like this. Do you need me to record anything else?" She smiled faintly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Just write it all down as it happened. The truth is enough." He nodded, returning to his desk, still visibly shaken. In the hallway, Pam Bondi stood waiting, arms crossed, her sharp eyes watching the reporters trying to get close. When Leavitt stepped out, Bondi motioned her over. "You shook the system today," she said, her voice low but proud. "Thornton's not the only one. We need to dig deeper. Mitchell's just the start." Leavitt nodded, gripping her documents tightly. "I agree, ma'am. He just offered to cooperate. Should we consider it?" Bondi frowned, thinking for a second before replying. "No. He chose this path, and now he faces full accountability. I'll order an expanded investigation immediately. Everyone tied to Thornton will be exposed." She paused, looking Leavitt straight in the eye. "You exceeded my expectations, Karoline. The president will be pleased with you." Leavitt smiled, feeling a wave of relief. "Thank you, but I know you're the one who sealed it." Bondi chuckled softly, a rare but warm smile. "We're a team. You opened the door, I kicked it wide open. Now go brief the president. I'll handle the rest." She patted Leavitt's shoulder, then turned to signal the Justice Department officers to proceed. Leavitt nodded, stepping out of the hallway, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. Outside the courthouse, a crowd began to gather. News of Thornton's arrest spread fast, and people flocked in, some holding phones to record, others shouting, "Justice for the people!" A middle-aged woman in a red coat yelled to a reporter, "It's time to clean out this corruption." The air buzzed with excitement mixed with outrage. The public had long awaited a moment like this. On social media, Leavitt Bondi began trending, with tens of thousands of posts praising the two women who took down Thornton. One user wrote, "Karoline Leavitt, just 27, made a judge pay the price. This is the future of justice." Another added, "Pam Bondi shows no mercy. She's a nightmare for the corrupt." Leavitt didn't have time to check her phone, but she knew what she and Bondi had just done would change how people viewed the justice system. She stepped out of the courthouse, sunlight hitting her youthful yet resolute face. A reporter rushed forward, thrusting a microphone toward her. "Ms. Leavitt, how do you feel seeing Judge Thornton arrested?" She paused, looking straight into the camera. "I feel justice has been served. This isn't about me or Miss Bondi. It's about the American people who deserve honesty and transparency." She turned away before they could ask more, walking to her car with a calm demeanor. Karoline Leavitt climbed into the black SUV parked outside the courthouse, March sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating her youthful but determined face. The chants for justice from the crowd outside faded as the car door slammed shut. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the stillness envelop her, but inside her mind, everything still swirled. The image of Judge Edward Thornton in handcuffs, Robert Mitchell's panicked eyes, and Pam Bondi's commanding presence entering the courtroom played like a relentless reel. She knew today wasn't just a personal victory. It was a bold statement from the Trump administration. Justice would be served, no matter who stood in the way. The driver, a White House security agent, glanced through the rearview mirror. "Straight to the White House, ma'am?" Leavitt nodded, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, I need to see the president." The car pulled away from the courthouse, where the crowd still gathered, holding phones to record and shouting her and Bondi's names. On the drive, she pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up with a flood of X notifications. One post stood out. "Karoline Leavitt and Pam Bondi just took down Judge Thornton. This is how we make America great again. Leavitt Bondi." She smiled faintly, not for the praise, but for the deeper meaning of this triumph. At the White House, Leavitt walked down the long hallway, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She was led straight to the Oval Office, where Donald Trump sat behind his desk, his sharp eyes looking up as she entered. He stood, a wide smile spreading across his face, a rare but genuine one. "Karoline," he said, his voice warm and deep, "you made big things happen today. Thornton cuffed right in court. I watched it live. Outstanding!" He came around the desk, clapping her shoulder like a proud father. Leavitt dipped her head slightly, maintaining her professionalism. "Thank you, sir, but I didn't do it alone. Miss Bondi sealed it." Trump laughed loudly, the sound echoing in the room. "Bondi is a warrior, no doubt, but you, Karoline, you started it. I picked you because I knew you had the strength to change things." He pointed at her, his eyes blazing. "Today proves our slogan. Make America great again. You and Bondi just sent that message to every crook thinking they can dodge justice." She nodded, feeling the weight of his praise. "We're not done, sir. Mitchell's cooperating, but Miss Bondi thinks there are more involved." Trump furrowed his brow, thinking for a second before nodding. "Good. Don't stop. I want them all dragged into the light, every last one. You and Bondi keep going." "I've got your backs." He returned to his chair, sitting with a satisfied air. "Now go rest. You've earned it." Leavitt left the Oval Office, relieved but not fully at ease. She knew, for Trump, this was just the beginning. As she stepped outside, her phone buzzed. A text from Bondi flashed on the screen. Mitchell named some names. "Meet me tomorrow, 7 a.m., my office." She smiled, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Bondi never stopped fighting, and neither would Leavitt. But before diving into the next battle, she needed a moment to herself. The car took her to her home in suburban Washington, D.C., where warm yellow light spilled from the windows. Stepping inside, she heard her 8-month-old son's laughter as he played with her mother in the living room. Ellen, her mom, looked up as she entered. "Karoline, you've been on TV all day. Your son kept pointing at the screen every time he saw you." Leavitt smiled, kicking off her shoes and kneeling beside the boy. She hugged him, feeling his tiny warmth in her arms. "You watched him all day. Thanks so much, Mom." Ellen waved a hand, smiling kindly. "Don't say that. You're doing big things out there. I'm just holding down the fort." She paused, looking at her with proud eyes. "You remind me of when you were little. Always steadfast, always fighting for what's right. Today, you did that for the whole country." Leavitt bowed her head, emotions welling up. She kissed her son's forehead, whispering, "I do it all for you. You know that." That night, after her son slept, Leavitt sat alone in her small study. She opened her laptop, scrolling through X posts. Tens of thousands were talking about the case, about her, Bondi, Thornton. One post made her pause. Karoline Leavitt isn't just press secretary. She's a symbol of a new generation, proving youth can change the system. She closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. But then she thought of Mitchell, the names Bondi would soon reveal, and the pressure of her role. Being press secretary wasn't just about speaking to the public. It was about standing up for what she believed in, even with the world watching. She stood, stepping onto the balcony, gazing at Washington's night sky. A cool breeze swept through her hair, bringing a mix of freedom and responsibility. Her mind flashed to Thornton being led away, his resentful glare in their final exchange earlier in the courtroom. He'd said, "I demand a full explanation before any measures are taken." His deep voice stern, clinging to a judge's authority. But he'd failed. She wasn't afraid, never had been, yet she knew the road ahead would be tough. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Bondi. "Mitchell's list is longer than I thought. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., be ready. The bigger fight's coming." Leavitt typed back quickly, "I'll be there." She pocketed the phone, breathing in the night air. She thought of Trump, his promise of a more transparent America. She thought of her son, sleeping peacefully next door, and the future she wanted him to grow up in. Today was a win, but not the end. It was the start of a long fight. She stepped back inside, closing the balcony door, her eyes blazing with resolve. Tomorrow she'd meet Bondi and they'd press on. Thornton had fallen, Mitchell was talking, but others were out there, those who thought they could escape. Leavitt smiled, a cold but confident smile. They wouldn't hide for long. She and Bondi would find them, one by one, and justice wouldn't stop. Beyond the courtroom drama, this story of Karoline Leavitt and Pam Bondi teaches us a profound lesson. Justice isn't just about winning a single battle, it's about relentless courage and preparation in the face of power. Leavitt didn't let Thornton's insults shake her. She armed herself with evidence and stood firm, proving that determination can topple even the untouchable. In real life, this means we must equip ourselves with knowledge and resolve, whether confronting unfairness at work, in our communities, or against systemic corruption. It's not enough to complain, we need to act, find allies, and persist, just as Leavitt and Bondi did. Their victory shows that change starts with individuals unwilling to back down. Thanks for watching this journey unfold. Your support keeps us going. Please like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to join us in exploring more stories of justice and resilience. See you next time.